Okay, welcome back everybody to the Murmurations podcast. Today I am joined by my colleague, Tina Sikka. Hello, Tina.
Hi.
Tina's a lecturer in media and cultural studies, and we are going to talk about loads of stuff today. Before we get into anything, do you just want to tell us about your background, interests, and teaching and research?
Yeah, as you can probably tell, the audience can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from the UK. So I'm Canadian. Grew up in Vancouver, did all of my sort of academic work in Canada, either in Vancouver or out east in Toronto and Ottawa. Communication studies, and I did a book in communication studies as well. Interests really vary, but a lot of it is down to studies of gender, philosophy of science, looking at environmental issues and food. I discuss issues of race as well, but it's sort of about how we construct knowledge in different spheres and how we validate that knowledge. And I'm writing a book right now on Me Too and consent and restorative justice.
Yeah, I mean, before we get into any specifics about your research, I just thought, given what's happened this week with A-levels, and there's been obviously lots of talk about university places and stuff like that, a debate came up on, I think it started on Twitter and then managed to kind of spread, about Mickey Mouse subjects and media studies being a Mickey Mouse subject, which was always a thing you used to hear when I was doing my A-levels. And I honestly thought that lessons have been learned to the point where people realise how ridiculous it was to overlook the significance of studying media and having people being media literate and having critical thinking around media. Do you just want to talk about the importance, from your perspective, the importance of studying media and why it matters so much?
Yeah, I mean, I find it really frustrating, the way that it's sort of looked at as, yeah, like a Mickey Mouse subject. I think that, you know, media is such, and communication in general, is such a large and interdisciplinary, you know, area of research. I think a lot of it has to do with how we create cultures and how we negotiate ideas and how those ideas spread and how they can hinder or help democracy. They can be entertaining, you know, as well. And so it's that kind of cultural production. And it's so that critical analysis of ideas that come out of media scholarship that for some reason just is not translating to a general reputation of the field. And it's interesting too, because in the States, I know that there is a stream of communication studies which is very administrative, and it's sort of like hived off from English. And so I thought that maybe it's like a moderated English studies. You take communication. Right. And so I thought some of that reputation was maybe rubbing off and infecting the larger reputation, but it seems that, you know, media and it's an easy course for some reason has just become, you know, together, like put together. I'm not sure why it still persists. The A-level thing I think is really interesting too, in terms of the way the algorithm has come up for scrutiny, because that's part of media studies too. It's that, you know, these technical systems that through which we produce knowledge and what goes into those systems. And if, you know, we are structuring them to those hierarchies that exist in society become reflected in the algorithms. And I think that, yeah, you know, that's happened here.
That's a really important point, actually. I was seeing a friend was saying online the other day, why does everyone keep saying that the algorithm was faulty or the algorithm didn't work? He said the algorithm did exactly what it was meant to do. It was meant to do what it did, and the way in which certain students with certain backgrounds got a worse deal out of it. It was doing what it was designed to do. It wasn't faulty. So we should be looking at it in an ideological context rather than some kind of numbers game that's just reducible down to a method on a computer. There was more to it than that.
Yeah, I like what Kathy O'Neill, she wrote a book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, and she talks about algorithms as like garbage in, garbage out. That if you're just putting those, inequalities into the algorithm, you're going to get the same ones that come right out.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about your research on food then? Because I find that really, really interesting. It's something I don't know much about. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I've been trying in different ways to connect some of the really interesting stuff that's going around in food studies, generally sort of hived off from sociology, and bring it more into media and media studies. And so I've been doing a little bit of work on how different social movements, from health movements to intellectual movements, political movements, use food as a marker of identity. And of culture, and of a way to kind of communicate that through consumption. So it's like this really interesting kind of like material, this use of material, also symbolic to reflect identity and representation. And so for the political side, I do work on, how different political movements like the intellectual dark web and more far right movements, and also vegan movements, that political ideology and food consumption is really fusing together. One of the really interesting things I was looking at is in Portland, where you had, the uprising there, and you had, street battles for days, that one of the symbols of that sort of social solidarity between the activists there was this guy who put up a rib shop, and it was called Riot Ribs, and it was just like in the middle of like smoke grenades and tear gas was this like stand where people were getting ribs every day consistently. And so it became like this marker, which I found really quite interesting in the context of even Portland, which is notoriously kind of more like vegan and very health conscious. But it was this like, yeah, I just found it really, really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I've done some research about the intellectual dark web, you mentioned a moment ago. What did you did a paper about food and the intellectual dark web, didn't you?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so the argument I was making there was that there was this really interesting phenomenon of the way that food consumption was being used as, again, a marker of that collective kind of group identity between followers, usually of the intellectual dark web, but also by sort of the leaders or the proponents of that political views. And so you had particularly this focus on meat consumption, that kind of masculine, back to gender norms, consumption of meat as being not only healthy, but being an appropriate expression of political identity. So it was a little sort of going back to like the way Carol Adams talks about meat as masculinity, but it was being shown in a very different way because it fused with health discourse.
Right.
And how to kind of have appropriate health and be the best you can, and some of that uplift of that do it yourself self-help ethos that like Jordan Peterson had at some point as well.
Right. So that, if I remember rightly, so Jordan Peterson went to a meat only. He was just eating steaks, wasn't he?
Yeah.
It was steak and greens, and then just steaks.
Yeah.
And his daughter also writes a blog about this stuff as well, doesn't he? Did you look at any of that?
Yeah, and a lot of that, like the podcast that she has on that, she says that it treated her autoimmune disease.
Oh, that was it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so she had a podcast and she wrote a book, and her dad said that, really, like Jordan Peterson, her father, said that it had really helped his health. But it's the discourse I just found really quite interesting because it came down to these, reflecting these ideas about cultural values and meat and really that, yeah, that just that kind of masculine focus on men eat meat, women eat salads, binary that you often find. And then I was kind of discussing how even, you know, some scholars or thinkers like Sam Harris, who is not vegan but says that that's probably the best way to eat, you know, and admits it, that there was this way that they started talking about vegan and more vegetarian diets through the lens of, don't worry, you can still have the same kinds of body types and the same kinds of activities, and sort of do it in a way that doesn't challenge your masculinity. So it was like how those foods are really quite gendered, and they were being used in political discourse.
If I remember rightly as well, Sam Harris went vegetarian for a while and then had to eat meat again for health reasons, whatever they may have been. But he's talked a lot about the this isn't my area of expertise at all, but what do you call it when you can sort of manufacture meat without it? Because there's a lot of research going into this. Is the possibility of reproducing and manufacturing real meat, but without actually breeding and slaughtering animals.
Yeah, I just wrote a piece on lab grown meat. So it's like, yeah,
Right.
that it's actually done in a laboratory. So it's, you know, those ethical concerns around manufacturing and environmental concerns would be taken care of. And so, yeah, that there was, you know, there's conversations around that as well. And then also, you know, the processed meats, like the faux meat that you can buy, and how sometimes, you know, that can use a lot of water and soy and not be particularly healthy as well. So it's this, yeah, I find it really, really interesting because each political movement is starting to use food and meat in a really, you know, quite interesting way. And even, you know, can even go back to racialized discourses. So arguments, you know, some people on the far right were saying that milk drinking was particularly like a white identity thing, you know, where they were using genetic arguments to say that people who are Caucasian were more evolved because they could process milk. And so you had these people having these like milk ins where they would just go on YouTube and drink a lot of milk to show their white identity. Very strange, but there's no genetic basis for that. There's no, like, you know, it's really extraordinary how that works.
Yeah, no, I've never heard of that. In terms of the intellectual dark web, we were talking before, I find that it's been a really fascinating thing. I mean, I've written a piece about it in terms of its kind of the cohesive narrative that binds so many different people, because I do see some debates online where it gets dismissed as being right wing and alt right and so on, but actually there's a real eclectic mix of people in the intellectual dark web, and I found it really fascinating the way in which this kind of metaphor was used by Eric Weinstein, and then it's become this kind of accommodating ground for all these different conversations and voices and people with different political leanings to talk. But do you want to say anything about the intellectual dark web from your perspective? Like, why do you think this thing has cottoned on and been so popular, or not popular in many cases at all? Either way, it's really caused a stir, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think for me, it was really interesting because when I was a PhD student, I was at York University and in Toronto, and I was doing a PhD in psychology, and was like, oh, Jordan Peterson is doing like a talk, you know, do you want to just come by the campus and we'll go to the talk? And so I went to it, and it wasn't particular, it was a scholarly talk, so it wasn't particularly, you know, like there wasn't anything that was, you know, controversial. It was maybe 2006 or something like that.
Right.
And so I then started to hear about him much more later on, and then there was the whole issue with the pronouns. And then Barry Weiss's piece came out on the intellectual dark web. And so I find the political movement itself, you know, it's sort of carved out a space that is not far right by any means. I mean, you would kind of think, you know, Sam Harris, for example, being sort of liberal, and Richard Dawkins as well. But I think the core ideas around, you know, some of it around hierarchy and of these natural hierarchies, I find problematic. And I think that some of it, you know, around the way they talk about like social justice warriors and how there's a skepticism sometimes around identity as an important category for organizing society or knowledge. I have a problem with some of the stuff on gender and women's roles. I think can be particularly problematic, and race as well.
Yeah, I mean the hierarchy stuff, the evolutionary conversations around hierarchy caused quite a lot of debate, with particularly with Jordan Peterson's talked about it as well. Peterson's a funny one because he's made one point that I really agree with, which is that hierarchies, it's what goes on within hierarchies that we should be concerned by. So the fact that hierarchies will always occur, and it's what goes on within them that we should keep in check, I really agree with. But the idea that I know less about are these kind of, or the arguments I understand less about, are the biological and evolutionary arguments about how particular hierarchies form. Because I always come back to the idea that one of the evolutionary traits we have as humans is the ability to reason and adapt. And therefore, if we have that evolutionary trait and an ability to reason and adapt, we can always question the way in which our hierarchies form. And we have the ability to go, well, that might not be fair then. So don't let that happen. So I don't know what you want to say about that.
Yeah, I think that there are better metaphors than the hierarchy. That, you know, when you can look like, you know, at feminist materialism or at different kinds of structures like rhizomes or assemblages, where you get these kind of relations that form and then can be challenged and then reformed in different ways.
Yeah.
I just find that is a much more flexible and reflective of our present position than hierarchy. And I think a lot of scholars are still back in that kind of framework.
I think assemblages is a much more helpful way. I think even then when I was talking, it's funny how we get, even as people who study language, there's certain terms that we just carry on using because we go, well, that's the term we always use. But actually, when you think about things in terms of assemblages, it allows for that nuance that kind of gets lost in ideas of structured hierarchy.
Yeah, I really like Karen Barad's work, or Rosie Bradati does some really interesting stuff about just like you have these assemblages and then you do these like cuts of these different structures that cohere together for a little while, and you can do that analysis, but they might disassemble and then cohere differently elsewhere.
So yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, I was talking to Tony Sampson in an earlier episode where he talks about the assemblage brain. He talks about assemblages in relation to consciousness and stuff like that. It's fascinating stuff. One thing we were talking about before in relation to the IDW, so even though I find some figures within it really fascinating, I like Brett Weinstein, I like Sam Harris, but there's a concern I have about IDW discourse that is, and somebody on the Joe Rogan, and I forgot his name, somebody on the Joe Rogan podcast the other week was talking about this thing called nut picking. And it concerns me slightly that there's this habit in the IDW of going in and nut picking. And what this was described as, I've never heard this term before, but we see a case, like say the Evergreen case, for instance, just as an example, involving Brett Weinstein, and then we take that as an example of, say, campus culture, or this is what student activists are like, or this is what academics are now like. And this person was saying on the Joe Rogan podcast, the way in which as well we'll zoom in on a particular academic with, say, who's making a bonkers argument or something. You say, this is symbolic of another problem that's just really widespread and representative of everybody working in the social sciences and the humanities and so on. But it's not like that at all. Again, it's much more nuanced than that, and there is space for civilized conversation and even disagreement. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I know you talked about cancel culture recently and the nuances around that get lost in public debates. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, I find it really interesting around campus culture particularly, but I think that kind of intellectual move of taking the extreme case and then making that representative of larger trends happens all the time.
Yeah.
I've been having even conversations around prison abolition where it's like, well, what about the axe murderer? You know, it's like, do you want to let out the axe murderer? And I'm like, what axe murderer are you talking about? You know, it's like, it's this like, take those extreme cases and then try to extrapolate them onto, like, you can't make policy off of the extreme case. That's just not, you know, how things should work. And I think for campus culture and this idea that you've got an entire university system that is, you know, social justice oriented and entirely, you know, on the left is just not representative of the way most campuses are. Nor is it the case that there are constant controversies over speech. And I think that, you know, for a university to say no, I mean, you have the right to say anything you want, but you don't have the right to a platform in a university. Like, that's the discretion of the students of the university. Like, you can still go on a street and give your speech, that's fine. But it's this idea that you not only have the right to say it, but you have the right to a platform so that everyone can hear you say it, which I think is being quite, you know, confused. And I think with cancel culture, it's the same kind of thing. It's that, you know, you're going on, you know, to the Atlantic magazine decrying cancel culture from a platform that no one else is going to have access to. No one whose speech could be, you know, no one from the marginalized group, no one who's disempowered. They don't have those platforms. They've been perpetually canceled. And so I don't think my thing is that, like, we should be canceling people. I think that it's that, you know, cancel culture, when you have ideas that are harmful, I mean, harmful to the extent that they can incite violence, that they dehumanize people and say that you are not, you know, that you're just, you know, someone who can be dismissed, your humanity is dismissed, then it becomes an issue where we have to take a closer look and say, okay, you know, what is going on here, and how can we have conversations that are productive and not so toxic.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's a really tricky thing. When I heard you talking on, you had a couple of media, like mainstream media appearances for, I think I heard you on 5 Live.
Yeah.
And I can't actually remember. Was it to do with J.K. Rowling? Was it after the J.K. Rowling thing?
No, it had to do with J.K. Rowling. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking, I'm not sure that I have the same position as Tina on this. Maybe I'm more critical of cancel culture than she is, and maybe I'm more lenient in terms of us, who we should allow to speak and therefore debate with, and potentially use campuses to challenge certain ideas, which, you know, may be a painful process when you've got the person there, but actually what comes out of it is much more helpful. I think that's what I was thinking in my position. But equally, when you were making the case you were making, I thought, well, this is also an example of somebody who's taking this position and isn't this hysterical, outraged stereotype that keeps getting associated with it. And I think constantly, this is why I'm fascinated with the internet dark web, is because as much as I like some of the, even the people I disagree with, I find quite engaging, and I like some of the stuff that goes on within it and the discussions within it. We can't keep representing things as these really unreasonable people represent the universities and the mainstream media, and then these people can't be heard because, as you just said, well, they clearly can be heard. And I just think, sorry, the point I wanted to get to was that even in my teaching, like I've talked about Jordan Peterson in classes, and the students don't get outraged that he's appearing on the lecture slides, and they don't get outraged that, because there's some classes, because I do stuff on mythology. So he's really useful when he talks about mythological storytelling and archetypes and understanding how stories can be read and psychology. I sometimes say to the students, okay, you might be aware of this figure in relation to these other debates where he's quite controversial. Let's put that to one side for a minute and just look at this and see if we find this useful, see if he's got some stuff to say. And some students said, look, there was a Canadian student who said to me, I really don't like Jordan Peterson. I don't like his politics, but he has been really useful on this module in other ways. And it was, now that, whether one agrees with that or not is always besides the point. It's the point there, the reason I think that's interesting is because the students are so much more nuanced and reasonable and sensible than this hysterical kind of stereotype that I think is being formed about young students these days, particularly the youth of today sort of thing, snowflake, all that kind of stuff. I think we need to do a better job of speaking out on their behalf and saying, look, this really isn't what campus culture is like.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting because the piece that I think that HuffPost and BBC saw to contact me was around a piece I did for the conversation where I talked about how cultural theory can be used to think about whether or not you want to consume a piece of art or culture from someone that's been canceled, in like quotation marks. And so I talked about Barthes and that, like, you know, Roland Barthes' sort of idea of the death of the author. And so, you know, can we maybe say that, you know, like TV shows and movies, there's a division of labor, you know, just if one person has been you know, found to have harassed or assaulted someone, you know, you have to take into consideration that they're not the sole producer, that it is kind of perpetuating this great man theory of art and history, that it's this, like, you know, the sole person in a room comes up with this and this piece of art emerges, and that just sort of take a more nuanced stance on the kind of art we consume. And so I really find that when I do bring controversial ideas or pieces of art or culture into the classroom, that students are quite able to assess and talk about it in ways that are really sophisticated and not, you know, out of fear or representative of this kind of like snowflake impression that we have. Like, they're just not like that.
Yeah, I mean, the only times when I had one particular experience of people being unreasonable was actually not with students at all. It was with academics. It was at a conference where I was talking about, I can't remember the details of the paper now, but I was talking about Russell Brand and Jordan Peterson because of the podcasts that they did together, and looking at Carl, the way in which they talk about Carl Jung. So when they both Brand and Peterson, who have very different politics, both really like Carl Jung and use his work a lot when they're talking. And I was looking at the conversation they had and trying to partly look at the way in which Jung, even though people sometimes say, I'm talking about psychology now, I'm not doing politics. It's like, you really can't. It's not as simple as that. Jungian concepts and theories can be used to accommodate these different political positions, but also the way in which they spoke to each other was also, they were both very accommodating of each other as well. They had this really civilized, constructed discussion. it's one of those occasions where Peterson didn't get so like wound up. But I tried to talk about that, and there's a couple of people really angry at this comment. I could tell they were angry. The Q&A came up, and because Russell Brand talks about the 12 steps, so the 12 steps of recovery in terms of addiction. And I was talking about that because there's addiction in my family. So I've seen how the 12 steps works for a family member recovering from heroin addiction, which is like Russell Brand. And so I was talking about that stuff. And then Peterson's obviously got the 12 rules for life. So these two people in the audience said, well, you've got him with his 12, and he's a terrible misogynistic bloke and he's got his 12 steps. And then you've got this other sexist bloke who's got his 12 rules, and all these other terrible things about how similar they are. Mm-hmm. I think 12 was the link. And I said, well, just if you go and watch this conversation that they had, the reason I'm talking about it is for these reasons. And they just, one person who's particularly angry just folded their arms and said, well, I'm not looking at anything involving Peterson because he's our Trump, meaning this person obviously Canadian.
Yeah.
And I just thought, I've got no problem with people having their opinion, and if they, don't like Brand or Peterson for whatever reason, like, fine. But as academics doing research in this kind of stuff, we're not, and especially if we want to break down these stereotypes of unreasonable, lefty, outraged, whatever, that's not conducive to the progressive conversations we need to be having.
Yeah, and I think it's this, like, take up the ideas if you're going to disagree.
Yeah.
That especially in an environment where it's like a conference, it's like, okay, if you're going to disagree, then disagree on the ideas, like disassemble those. Not necessary. And the fact that there was this, space where, I could say a similar thing about the Ezra Klein, Sam Harris, sort of like 2-hour podcast they did together.
Yeah.
Where it becomes this, I think it I would say that it's probably not as, it was pretty civil, like it wasn't, bad or anything. And I think that they got their points across, but they focused on the ideas.
Yeah.
It wasn't this kind of, just going after a person and saying that, no, I'm not going to listen. It just doesn't work. Like it just makes it more difficult.
Yeah. Have you, because I'm aware that we're going to run out of time at some point, what I wanted to talk to you about was something we discussed earlier, is, especially in relation to current events, the way in which certain groups like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, they're kind of, because of the things going on at the moment, we've got the certain groups gaining more attention and more popularity, and becoming slightly more mainstream is probably the wrong term, but you know what I mean. And having to try and work out some of the political contentions and potential contradictions within those movements. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I thought it was really interesting. You were telling me stuff that I was completely unaware of.
Yeah, I'm right now writing a book on sort of ideas around sexual consent and some of the contradictions within Me Too. So one of the key ones that we were talking about that I find really interesting is around Me Too's really focus on carceral feminism. So the end goal is to have someone in jail, and how I was really interested in this contradiction between Me Too activists and celebrities in particular that are supportive of Black Lives Matter, one of whose key platforms is prison abolition and decarceration, and so that there's this disjuncture between put them all in jail, the prison system is racialized and doesn't work, that I'm really interested in, and I'm sort of looking at other forms of justice around like transformational restorative justice practices, changing our ideas around consent to better fit realities. So really exploring different models of sexual autonomy, but asking the question of, is there a way to articulate a kind of model of sexual autonomy that is consistent with the norms and gender hierarchies we have, maybe in a way to deconstruct them, but also supportive of decarceration. So, you know, is it like a problem in feminism? Is it a problem in the history of rape law and assault law? You know, how can we think about restorative justice in that context? And so, yeah, that contradiction I was finding really interesting. There has been some, like a few articles, media ones, about Me Too and the need for transformative justice. You know, because I mean, the way that the cases come to court, and it's just like, it doesn't work in terms of the statistics or clear up rates and satisfaction of victims. It's quite, you know, bad. So it's like, what are these other models? And I think Black Lives Matter has a much better approach than Me Too does.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Black Lives Matter, another thing we were talking about earlier on was, at some stage it's going to, I think these debates are going to come up in terms of the principles of Black Lives Matter that so many people agree with and so many people are on board with and absolutely fine with, but then some groups or agendas within the movement have other agendas such as abolishing capitalism or getting rid of the police, that a lot of people who are supporting Black Lives Matter now, who might not be quite so familiar with these debates and discussions either, are also going to be like, well, hold on, I do support Black Lives Matter, but I don't agree with abolishing capitalism, or I don't know what you mean by abolishing the police. But I've seen you talking about the debate about policing before, where you said, well, it's not about taking the police force now and just shutting it down and then go, right, what should we do instead? What you're saying is, if you invest more in other things like, well, we were talking about addiction a minute ago, so mental health or support for addiction or all these other things, then you wouldn't need the extreme, or you wouldn't need this kind of policing that we currently need now, which is so conflict based. Am I getting that right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And it's this idea that not only is it not working in the sense of, you know, it's not serving the people who are incarcerated, who come out worse than they go in a worse, you know, situation. But also the victims tend to not, you know, it's an adversarial system. Usually the person is put on trial themselves, you know, their past behavior or, you know, what they wore, all of that, you know, can be really traumatizing. But I think that what prison abolition is really about is that, you know, that there would be a process of defunding, looking at nonviolent crime, taking a public health model, where if you did have that, you know, that serial rapist, it could be like a public health holding. Like there are different approaches to it, but, you know, having more social supports, mental health being taken care of by public health workers, this idea of pods of accountability, where, you know, if something went wrong, you wouldn't necessarily have to call the police. There would be like someone who is in the community that you would call. And these are all, you know, types of community accountability that were there before policing. Policing's, you know, a couple hundred, you know, not even years old, in the way that we know it. So that there were these models of safety and of care that were present before, and it's about, you know, bringing those back. Although there was a really good argument around the problem with social work and social workers as a model as well, because in Canada, there's the, you know, the legacy of social workers around family breakups in Aboriginal communities, because it was social workers that came in and took kids from Aboriginal kids and Indigenous kids from there. Yeah, so there's also that aspect to it, that it has to be a systemic change of non kind of, you know, forceful policing practices. Yeah,
I think the main point for me, I think, is that if we talked about all of these other alternative approaches to policing, or alternatives from policing, or just as forms of social support that we need in society, if we just talked about them rather than, because at the moment I think when the argument's pitched around, say, abolishing the police, it's really hard to get to the point of those really specific examples of things in the community that might be really, really helpful, because people keep coming back to, yeah, but you can't abolish the police. And I just feel like the debate itself would benefit from, look, we are where we are. We have a police force. Maybe there'll be less pressure on the police if we did all these other things. And I think if we really had radical reform that brings in all of these other community support things and stuff for mental health and addiction and so on, you may see radical change that just simply doesn't require policing in the same. I personally think you will always have and need some kind of police service, but service is the key word there. Maybe it would be more like a police service that's always in one way or another required, rather than something that is either so conflict based, so overstretched, or in American terms, so military.
Yeah, I like to say like abolish militarized policing. Like that's sort of the way that it works, and also more training and not having this kind of, you know, gung-ho like Rambo style type of adversarial relation to communities, and so that there are larger structures of racism there that need to be attended to, and transphobia also. That have to be attended to.
I don't know if have you seen Flint Town on Netflix?
No, I haven't.
It follows this. So Flint Town, I think it had one of the worst crime rates in America, and this police chief came in, and through these kind of more military practices, he really clamped down on gangs and gang leaders and their dealers. And he brought the crime and murder rate right down. But there was so much animosity towards them in the community that they almost didn't get, because they have this thing in America where they have their standard funding, but then you can also get this top up funding from like your community, but the community vote on whether they want to give the police force that funding. Yeah. And I think, if I remember rightly, they had the vote, and I think they just about held on to it, but then something happened with the council and a certain amount of funding was withdrawn or something. And then the rate went back up again. And I thought, well, that's a perfect example of, because the structural stuff and the social and community issues and the causes of poverty and crime aren't being addressed, you've got this constant battle between bringing it down with these military kind of practices, being hated by a community for it, and potentially not getting the support you need for it, and then the crime goes back up again. It's just this endless cycle.
Yeah, and I know that happens in Brazil. There's been cycles of that in the favelas. They'll like clamp down, and then they'll put the pressure off, and then it goes back up again.
Yeah, because the structures remain the same. Yeah. Really interesting stuff. I've got a feeling that we're running out of time here, so thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm sure I'll end up using this in a class or two, and I'm sure the students will enjoy listening to it as well. I'll speak to you soon. Thank you.
No
All right.
Bye.